the U.S. war against terror in the first phase. Current history has an issue on terrorism with various scholars. Every single one of them talks about the motivations. Do they condemn them? No. What they're condemning is critics. They say critics should not be allowed to raise questions. The reason? We have to silence criticism, because everyone has to line up and sing hosannas to our leaders. That's the job of intellectuals. Round up the chorus so they all sing praises to your leaders while they march in the parade and tell you how magnificent we are. I mean, that's the historic task of intellectuals, not just here. I mean, it's a historic task. I mean, let's go back, say, to World War I, far enough away so we can think about it. What did intellectuals do during World War I? Well, first thing that happened is 93 leading German intellectuals published a manifesto calling on their colleagues in the rest of the world to support Germany in its magnificent aim to bring justice and peace to the world. What did the American intellectuals do? Exactly the same thing. In fact, they all lauded the magnificence of their own leaders. There were some exceptions. Most of them ended up in jail on both sides. So in Germany, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht objected and were in jail. In England, Bertrand Russell objected. He was in jail. In the United States, Eugene Debs is the leading figure in U.S. labor in the 20th century and a socialist presidential candidate. He went to jail for raising mild questions about Woodrow Wilson's war. And others were just repressed, like Randolph Bourne was kicked out of all of his journals and so on, because they didn't join the parade, and intellectuals are supposed to join the parade, and they do. Exceptions are so rare, you can practically list them. I mean, there are exceptions, and there are honorable ones. Actually, most of them are in the third world. I'll give you quite a few. But in the West, most intellectuals are very loyal and submissive. And what you're hearing is not, don't talk about motivations, because they're very selective, as I say. Wall Street Journal is okay, Current History is okay, the Yale University volume on Age of Terror is okay. It's critics who are not allowed to raise motivations because critics are not allowed to exist. Okay? So therefore they're not allowed to do what other people do, or in fact do anything. They have to join the parade. We've passed the point where you throw them into jail in the West, but you try to get rid of them in other ways, by vilification, by lies, by defamation, the various techniques that intellectuals know very well. It's part of their métier. So that's what you're hearing. And you can see that you're hearing that by the selectivity. So we don't have to bother with the argument because it's idiotic. Of course, if you're serious, you're going to try to find out the motivation of the Nazis too. I mean, anybody who's serious about Nazism, of course, is going to ask about the motivation. I mean, it's not even a question. Is that justification of them? Of course not. It's just elementary rationality. A good Martian reporter would also want to clarify a couple of basic ideas. First of all, he'd like to know what exactly is terrorism. And secondly, what's the proper response to it? Well, whatever the answer to the second question is, that proper response must satisfy some moral truisms. And the Martian can easily discover what these truisms are, at least as understood by the leaders of the war, what the self-declared war on terrorism, because they tell us. They tell us constantly that they're very pious Christians who therefore revere the Gospels, and have certainly memorized the definition of hypocrite given prominently in the Gospels. Namely, the hypocrites are those who apply to others standards that they refuse to accept for themselves. So the Martian understands then that in order to rise to the absolutely minimal moral level, we have to agree, and in fact insist, that if some act is right for us, then it's right for others, and if it's wrong when others do it, then it's wrong when we do it. That's the most elementary of moral truisms, and once the Martian realizes that, he can pack up his bags and go back to Mars because his research task is over. He would be unlikely to find a phrase, a single phrase, in the vast coverage and commentary about the war on terrorism that even begins to approach this minimal standard. Don't take my word for it. Try the experiment. Well, I don't want to exaggerate. You can probably find the phrase now and then way out at the margins, though very rarely. Nevertheless, this moral truism is recognized within the mainstream. It's understood to be an extremely dangerous heresy, and therefore it's necessary to erect impregnable barriers against it, even before anybody exhibits it, even though it's so rare. In fact, there's even a technical vocabulary available in case anybody would dare to engage in the heresy, to involve themselves in the heresy that we should abide by moral truisms that we pretend to revere. The offenders are guilty of something called moral relativism. That means the suggestion that we apply to ourselves the standards we apply to others, or maybe moral equivalence. That's a term which was invented, I think, by Jean Kirkpatrick to ward off the danger that somebody might dare to look at our own crimes. Or the term, or maybe they can be called involved, they're carrying out the crime of America bashing, or they're anti-Americans, which is a rather interesting concept. As far as I'm aware, the term is used elsewhere only in totalitarian states. For example, in Russia in the old days, where anti-Sovietism was the highest crime. If somebody were to publish a book in Italy, say, called The Anti-Italians, you can imagine what the reaction would be in the streets of Milan and Rome, or in any country where freedom and democracy are taken seriously. But let's suppose that the Martian isn't deterred by the inevitable tirades and stream of vilification, and suppose he persists in keeping to the most elementary moral truisms. Well, as I said, if he does that, he can just go home. But suppose out of curiosity, he decides to stay on and look a little bit further. So what'll happen? Well, back to the question, what is terrorism? Important one. Now, there's a proper course for a serious Martian reporter to follow to find the answer to that, look at the people who declare the war on terrorism and see what they say terrorism is. It's fair enough. And there is, in fact, an official definition in the U.S. Code and Army manuals elsewhere. It's defined briefly, terrorism, as I'm quoting, is defined as the calculated use of violence or the threat of violence to attain goals that are political, religious, or ideological in nature through intimidation, coercion, or instilling fear. Well, that sounds simple. As far as I can see, it's appropriate. But we constantly read that the problem of defining terrorism is very vexing and complex. And the Martian might wonder why that's true. Of course, the same is true for those who are victims of vastly worse terrorist crimes, but that's reported only on Mars. So you might try to find a report, say, of a conference run by Salvadoran